Some sounds don't belong to the living. They belong to the memories we were too afraid to touch. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe dignity and kindness can change even the hardest heart, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, back to Marcus Carter. For 3 years, no music had dared to breathe inside the Carter estate. The mansion stood atop a quiet hill overlooking the edge of Chicago, its black stone walls glowing beneath the pale light of a cold autumn moon. To strangers, it was simply the residence of Marcus Carter, the most feared Korean Mafia boss in the city, a man whose name ended negotiations before they ever became arguments. To those who worked behind its heavy iron gates, however, the mansion carried another reputation. They whispered that one room on the 3rd floor never truly slept. Every maid who had entered the estate learned the same rule before receiving a uniform. Never unlock the music room. Never touch the piano. Never ask about Mrs. Carter. No one questioned it. Questions had a way of disappearing in Marcus Carter's world. Naomi Brooks memorized the rule on her very first morning. She simply nodded. Yes, ma'am. Unlike the others, she never looked curious. She arrived before sunrise each day, tying her dark curls neatly beneath a modest scarf before quietly beginning another endless routine of polishing marble floors, dusting antique shelves, and restoring order to rooms larger than the apartment she had grown up in. She moved through the mansion like a gentle breeze, seen by almost no one, remembered by even fewer. Invisible people survived longer. That was something life had taught her long before this job. Marcus rarely noticed the staff. When he crossed the marble corridors dressed in tailored black suits, conversations died without warning. His security detail followed several steps behind, while every servant lowered their eyes instinctively. His footsteps echoed with authority. His silence echoed louder. Yet beneath that silence lived another sound. Or rather, the absence of one. Years ago, his late mother had filled the mansion with piano music every evening precisely at 7. Classical melodies drifted through every hallway, softening even the sharpest corners of the estate. After her passing, the grand piano had remained exactly where she left it, untouched, locked away, as though disturbing it would erase the last piece of her that still lingered inside those walls. Then came the rain. It arrived just after midnight. Wind pressed against the tall windows while distant thunder rolled across the dark sky. Most of the household slept soundly beneath thick blankets. Marcus did not. Sleep had become a stranger years ago. Standing alone inside his study, he stared through the rain-soaked glass with a tumbler of untouched whiskey resting beside him. Reports lay open across the mahogany desk, but he hadn't read a single line for nearly 20 minutes. His mother's birthday. He never allowed anyone to mention the date. He never needed to. His heart remembered it without permission. Then, a single piano note floated through the mansion. Soft, almost hesitant. Marcus froze. The crystal glass slipped slightly between his fingers. Another note followed. Then another. Not a melody. Only someone carefully testing broken keys. Impossible. No one had entered that room in 3 years. For one suspended heartbeat, logic abandoned him. His breathing slowed. His pulse thundered. The sound was exactly the same. The same gentle pressure. The same patient hesitation. The same touch his mother always used before beginning her favorite nocturne. Marcus set the glass down without realizing it. The mansion had remained silent for more than 1,000 nights. Yet tonight, someone had awakened its oldest memory. He stepped into the dim hallway. The rain outside continued beating against the windows, but another sound now guided him through the darkness. One lonely piano note. Then silence. Then another. Somewhere beyond the long corridor, the house seemed to be breathing again. The sound came again. Not a melody. Not even a complete chord. Just 3 hesitant notes floating through the darkness before silence swallowed them once more. Marcus Carter stood motionless beneath the crystal chandelier, every muscle in his body, refusing to obey the command to move. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, illuminated only by antique wall sconces that painted long golden shadows across polished marble floors. For 3 years, that corridor had been nothing more than stone and silence. Tonight, it remembered music. He began walking. Each measured step echoed softly through the mansion, accompanied by the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the towering windows. His security detail, stationed on the lower floor, never heard him leave his study. Marcus preferred it that way. Some memories demanded solitude. The closer he came to the music room, the quieter the notes became, as though whoever sat behind the old oak door feared being discovered. Then, nothing. Absolute silence. Marcus stopped only inches from the brass handle. His mother's name remained engraved on a small silver plaque beneath the lock. Evelyn Carter. He hadn't read those 2 words aloud since the day she died. His fingers hovered above the handle, but never touched it. Instead, another memory reached for him first. 7-year-old Marcus sat cross-legged on the Persian rug while his mother laughed softly behind the piano. Every evening she insisted he close his eyes before she played. "Music isn't meant to be seen," she would whisper. "It should find your heart before your ears." He used to count the seconds before the first note. Tonight, his heart counted them again. The memory vanished as quickly as it came. Marcus inhaled slowly before turning the brass handle. Locked. Exactly as it had been every night for the last 3 years. No broken lock. No damaged hinges. Nothing unusual. He frowned. Had grief finally become louder than reality? His eyes drifted downward. Fresh dust had been disturbed near the bottom of the door. Barely noticeable. A thin crescent where someone had recently knelt. Marcus crouched, running one finger lightly across the marble. Fine particles of aged wood clung to his fingertips. Not ordinary household dust. Sanding dust. He stared at it without speaking. Someone had been working here. Quietly. Patiently. Behind him, another voice interrupted the silence. "Sir." Marcus rose immediately. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly head housekeeper, stood at the far end of the corridor holding a folded stack of freshly pressed linens. She looked surprised to find him on the 3rd floor after midnight. "I thought I heard someone," Marcus said calmly. Mrs. Henderson's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "No one comes up here, sir." "You checked?" "Every night." Marcus continued studying the closed door. "The piano." Mrs. Henderson lowered her eyes. "No one has touched it since Mrs. Carter passed." There was no hesitation in her voice. Only sadness. Marcus nodded once. "You may go." She disappeared down the staircase, leaving him alone once again. Yet something felt wrong. Not because she had lied. Marcus had spent too many years reading faces to mistake deception. She believed every word she had spoken, which meant someone had entered the room without anyone noticing. The following morning, life inside the mansion unfolded with military precision. Breakfast was served at exactly 7. Meetings began at 8. Phones rang. Bodyguards rotated shifts. Staff crossed polished hallways with lowered eyes. Among them moved Naomi Brooks. Simple black uniform. White apron. Natural curls tucked neatly beneath a scarf. She carried a silver tray through the dining room with the same quiet grace she brought to every task, never rushing, never drawing attention to herself. Invisible. That was how Marcus remembered every member of his household staff. Yet today, something interrupted that habit. As Naomi reached to adjust a vase of white lilies near the grand staircase, Marcus noticed faint streaks of pale powder clinging beneath her fingernails. Not flour. Not cleaning residue. Wood dust. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Naomi seemed completely unaware of his presence until she turned. Their eyes met for less than a second. She lowered hers immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." Her voice was soft, respectful, completely steady. Marcus answered with only a slight nod. She continued walking toward the kitchen, unaware that he had not looked away. Long after she disappeared around the corner, Marcus remained standing beside the staircase. The mansion had protected one secret for 3 years. Now, for the very first time, it felt as though someone else had begun protecting it too. There was a difference between cleaning something and saving it. Naomi Brooks understood that difference long before she ever stepped inside the Carter estate. Every evening, after the last silver tray had been polished and the kitchen lights dimmed, she returned to the tiny staff room tucked beneath the west staircase. Most of the servants collapsed into bed after 14-hour shifts. Naomi never did. She waited, patiently, until the mansion surrendered to sleep. Only then did she quietly open the small wooden toolbox hidden beneath her bed. It wasn't expensive. Its corners were worn smooth by years of use, and the leather handle had cracked long ago. Inside rested a handful of carefully organized tools, a tuning lever wrapped in faded cloth, delicate screwdrivers, polishing oil, soft brushes, replacement felt, and tiny packets of steel strings that looked almost too fragile to survive another day. They had belonged to her father. Isaiah Brooks had never owned a music school. He had never performed on grand stages. He simply repaired old pianos that everyone else believed were beyond saving. When wealthy families bought new instruments, they called Isaiah to haul away the forgotten ones. Instead of throwing them out, he spent months restoring each cracked soundboard, each broken hammer, each silent key. As a little girl, Naomi used to sit beside him inside their tiny garage workshop. "Dad," she had once asked while watching him sand a warped wooden key, "why spend weeks fixing a piano nobody wants?" Isaiah smiled without looking up. "Because every piano remembers the hands that loved it." He placed the unfinished key into her palm. When people stopped listening, memories began to disappear. Those words had stayed with her long after cancer stole him away. Now, standing outside the forbidden music room shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning, Naomi found herself hearing his voice again. She removed a small brass key from her apron pocket. Not a stolen key. Mrs. Henderson had quietly handed it to her 2 nights earlier after. Discovering Naomi staring at the locked door. "I shouldn't do this," the elderly housekeeper had whispered. But Mrs. Carter deserved better than dust. That was all she said. Nothing more. No explanation. No permission. Just one old key passed from one grieving heart to another. The lock clicked softly. Naomi slipped inside before gently closing the door behind her. Moonlight poured through tall, arched windows, bathing the room in silver. White sheets covered most of the furniture like sleeping ghosts. At the center stood the grand piano. Its ebony finish had lost its shine beneath years of neglect. Dust rested thick across the closed lid. Several ivory keys had yellowed with age. One brass pedal leaned slightly to the left. To anyone else, it looked abandoned. To Naomi, it looked lonely. She walked toward it with the same quiet reverence others reserved for churches. Her fingertips brushed the polished wood. "I'm sorry it took someone this long to come back." The whisper barely disturbed the silence. She lifted the keyboard cover. A faint smell of cedar, old varnish, and aging felt escaped into the room. Carefully, she pressed a single middle C. The note emerged dull, flat. Its vibration died almost immediately. Naomi closed her eyes. Not broken, just neglected. A small smile appeared across her face. "You're still here." She rolled up the sleeves of her simple black uniform before opening the toolbox. One by one, each tool found its place beside the keyboard. She removed the front panel with practiced hands, exposing rows upon rows of wooden hammers resting like tiny soldiers frozen in time. Most people would have seen machinery. Naomi saw craftsmanship. Hours passed unnoticed. She cleaned years of dust from delicate joints using a soft horsehair brush. She tightened loose screws no larger than grains of rice. She replaced worn strips of felt that had hardened with age. Every movement remained slow, gentle, respectful. Whenever she finished one adjustment, she tested only a single note. Never a song. Never enough sound for anyone to recognize a melody. Just one careful heartbeat at a time. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Inside, the old piano seemed to breathe a little easier with every touch of her hands. Naomi never noticed the security camera mounted quietly above the hallway outside the music room. Nor did she realize that somewhere else inside the mansion, a tiny blinking monitor had just captured the impossible. For the first time in 3 years, someone was bringing Evelyn Carter's piano back to life. Some truths never announce themselves. They reveal themselves one heartbeat at a time. Marcus Carter had spent his entire life trusting evidence over instinct. In his world, every lie left a trace. Every betrayal created a pattern, and every secret eventually demanded a witness. Yet nothing about the past 3 nights made sense. The security footage played silently across the monitor in his private office. There she was, Naomi Brooks, entering the 3rd floor hallway at exactly 1:07 a.m. No hesitation, no fear, just a small wooden toolbox in one hand and a quiet determination that seemed strangely out of place inside a house ruled by violence and absolute obedience. Marcus watched as she disappeared through the music room door. Then nothing. The old security camera pointed only toward the hallway. It never reached inside. Nearly 3 hours later, Naomi emerged carrying the same toolbox. She closed the door with remarkable care, almost lovingly. Marcus replayed the footage. Again and again. No one behaved like that unless they cared deeply about what waited behind the door. But why would a housemaid risk her job for a piano that wasn't hers? It made no sense, which was exactly why Marcus couldn't stop thinking about it. The following evening, the mansion settled into its familiar rhythm. Meetings ended. Business associates departed. The bodyguards rotated shifts with military precision. Dinner was served in complete silence, interrupted only by the faint clink of crystal against porcelain. Naomi moved through the dining room exactly as she always did. Invisible, she refilled water glasses before anyone noticed they were empty. She straightened chairs after guests stood. She disappeared before gratitude could ever reach her. Marcus observed every movement without allowing his expression to change. There was nothing suspicious about her. Nothing except what happened after midnight. At 12:45, he dismissed his security detail. "I'll finish the reports alone." No one questioned the order. 15 minutes later, Marcus extinguished the lights inside his office and stepped quietly into the hallway. For the first time in years, the feared head of the Carter organization found himself following someone instead of being followed. He stayed several corridors behind Naomi. She never looked over her shoulder. She simply walked with calm, measured steps until she reached the 3rd floor. The old brass key slipped effortlessly into the lock. A soft click. The door opened, then closed once more. Marcus remained hidden in the darkness. He waited. 1 minute. 2. 5. Then, a single piano note floated beneath the door. Gentle, almost apologetic. Another followed. Then silence. Marcus approached without making a sound. The closer he came, the clearer he recognized the rhythm. These were not songs. They were individual notes, separated by long pauses. Testing, listening, correcting. The work of someone repairing an instrument, not performing on it. He stopped outside the door. The temptation to open it tightened across his chest. One turn of the handle, one step inside. Every question would finally have an answer. Instead, he heard something unexpected. Naomi's voice, barely above a whisper. "There you are." A pause. "That sounds much better." Another tiny adjustment echoed from inside. Metal turning softly, wood settling into place. Then one clear note rang through the room. This time, it lingered. Warm, balanced, alive. Marcus closed his eyes without realizing it. For the briefest moment, the mansion no longer felt empty. It sounded exactly as it had before grief took residence within its walls. His breathing grew slower. His hand rested against the cold oak door. He could almost picture his mother seated at the piano bench, smiling gently as music drifted through the house at sunset. The memory hurt, but for the first time in years, it also comforted him. Inside the room, Naomi continued working without the slightest awareness that someone stood only inches away. She wasn't stealing. She wasn't searching for hidden valuables. She wasn't violating the room. She was protecting it. Marcus slowly lowered his hand from the door. Tonight was not the night for confrontation. Some answers became clearer when left undisturbed. He turned and disappeared into the darkness as silently as he had arrived. Behind him, another perfectly tuned note filled the sleeping mansion. And somewhere deep inside Marcus Carter, a door far older than the one on the 3rd floor opened just a little. Some moments change a life, not because someone speaks, but because the silence finally tells the truth. The rain had disappeared, leaving the Carter estate wrapped in an almost sacred stillness. Shortly after 1 in the morning, Naomi unlocked the music room as she had done every night for the past week. She never imagined anyone was watching. Inside, moonlight rested gently across the grand piano, tracing silver lines along its polished lid. Every evening the instrument looked a little different. The layers of dust were gone. The faded ebony finish had begun reflecting light once more. Even the brass pedals carried a soft, golden glow after hours of careful polishing. Naomi smiled to herself. "You're almost ready." She placed her father's toolbox on the piano bench and slowly removed the front panel. Tonight would be the most delicate part of the restoration. The action mechanism. Hundreds of tiny wooden parts worked together beneath the keys. One mistake could damage the instrument forever. She breathed slowly before beginning. Outside the room, Marcus Carter climbed the final staircase alone. He hadn't planned to come. He had spent nearly an hour convincing himself to stay inside his office. Yet every unfinished report, every business call, every conversation had dissolved beneath a single question. Why? Why would someone spend countless hours repairing a piano that didn't belong to her? Why protect a memory that wasn't her own? His footsteps became slower as he reached the familiar oak door. Tonight, he wasn't searching for evidence. He was searching for understanding. From inside came the quiet sound of metal turning against aged wood. Then another perfectly tuned note. Marcus rested his hand upon the brass handle. No hesitation this time. The door opened. Slowly, without a sound. Naomi never looked up. She sat on the piano bench with one knee tucked beneath her, sleeves rolled above her elbows, completely absorbed in her work. Small screwdrivers lay neatly arranged beside strips of fresh felt. Tiny springs rested inside a porcelain bowl. Her fingers moved with extraordinary patience, adjusting each hammer as though comforting an injured bird. Marcus remained standing in the doorway, frozen, not because someone had entered the forbidden room, but because of the way she touched the piano. There was no curiosity, no greed, no fear, only reverence, as though she believed the instrument could still feel every movement of her hands. She paused to wipe a faint fingerprint from the polished wood with a soft white cloth. Marcus's breath caught. The cloth, his mother's embroidered handkerchief, cream-colored linen, tiny blue forget-me-nots stitched into one corner. He remembered placing it on the closed piano himself after her funeral. No one had been allowed inside since that day. Naomi carefully folded the handkerchief before using it once more to polish the fallboard. "So you can shine again," she whispered. Marcus felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. His mother used to say those exact words whenever she finished cleaning the piano. "So you can shine again." For years he had convinced himself that memories faded because time demanded it. Watching Naomi now, he realized memories disappeared only when no one cared enough to protect them. A floorboard creaked softly beneath his shoe. Naomi froze. The screwdriver slipped from her fingers, landing gently on the felt beside the keys. She slowly turned around. The color drained from her face. Mr. Carter, standing silently in the doorway. Neither of them spoke. The room seemed to stop breathing. Naomi immediately stood. I'm sorry, sir." Her voice barely existed. "I know I wasn't supposed to." Marcus raised one hand. Not to stop her, not to threaten her, simply because he couldn't find the words. His eyes remained fixed on the piano, on the carefully organized tools, on the freshly replaced felt, on the spotless ivory keys, on his mother's handkerchief resting beside them. Everything before him revealed weeks of quiet devotion. Work performed without permission, without recognition, without expecting gratitude. Finally, Marcus looked at Naomi. There was fear in her eyes. Not fear for herself. Fear that the piano would never be finished. For the first time since his mother's funeral, Marcus stepped fully into the room. The door closed softly behind him, and neither of them realized that the silence between them had already begun changing both of their lives. Sometimes the most difficult question is not, "Who are you?" It is, "Why would you do this for someone who has given you nothing?" The silence inside the music room stretched between Marcus Carter and Naomi Brooks like an invisible bridge neither of them knew how to cross. Outside, the first rays of dawn were still hours away. Inside, only the old piano seemed alive. Marcus stood beside the doorway, his dark eyes moving slowly across the instrument before settling on Naomi's trembling hands. She had not attempted to hide the toolbox. She had not tried to invent an excuse. She simply waited. If he dismissed her tonight, she would accept it. If he called security, she would not resist. But as she glanced once more toward the piano, Marcus noticed something unexpected. She wasn't worried about herself. She was worried that the restoration would never be finished. Finally, Marcus spoke. "You knew this room was forbidden." It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. Naomi lowered her head. "Yes, sir. And yet you came back." "Yes. Every night." Another quiet nod. Marcus studied her carefully. "Why?" The single word hung in the air. Naomi looked toward the piano instead of answering immediately. For a long moment, she gently rested her fingertips on the smooth, ebony lid, almost as if asking the instrument for permission to speak. "My father repaired pianos." Marcus remained silent. "He used to tell me that broken instruments are a lot like broken people." Her voice was calm now. "They don't stop having value just because they've stopped making music." She smiled faintly, though sadness lingered behind her eyes. "When I was little, I thought he was talking about wood and strings." She looked down at her hands. "Later I realized he was talking about grief. Marcus said nothing. Something inside him refused to interrupt. My father never turned anyone away. Naomi continued softly. Some families could pay him. Others couldn't. Sometimes widows would bring him a piano that had belonged to their husbands. Sometimes children cried because they thought the last thing their mother had ever touched was gone forever. She paused. My father always repaired those first. Why? Marcus asked almost instinctively. Naomi's eyes grew distant, as though she were seeing another workshop in another lifetime. Because he believed memories deserve maintenance too. The words settled heavily inside the room. He used to tell every customer the same thing. She closed her eyes for a moment. A piano doesn't die when its strings break. It dies when everyone stops listening. Marcus felt his chest tighten. His mother had once said something remarkably similar. Different words. The same heart. Naomi slowly walked toward the keyboard and pressed a single key. The note rang out with a warm, clear resonance. It took me less than a minute to realize this piano wasn't neglected because nobody loved it. She turned to face Marcus. It was neglected because someone loved it too much. The sentence struck him harder than any threat he had ever faced. He had locked the room to protect his mother's memory. Instead, he had imprisoned it. Naomi continued quietly. I wasn't trying to change anything that belonged to your family. She looked down at the embroidered handkerchief resting beside the keys. I just couldn't bear watching something so deeply loved disappear a little more every day. Marcus followed her gaze. For 3 years, he had believed keeping everything untouched was an act of loyalty. Now he saw the thin layer of fresh polish reflecting the moonlight, the carefully restored ivory keys, the renewed warmth in the instrument's voice. Nothing had been taken away. Everything had been given back. He walked slowly toward the piano. For the first time since his mother's funeral, he stood close enough to smell the familiar scent of cedar and old varnish. His fingers hovered above the keyboard. They trembled. I've never touched it. His voice almost disappeared. Since she died. Naomi looked at him with quiet understanding. You don't have to play. She offered a gentle smile. Sometimes healing begins with simply touching what you've been afraid to lose. Marcus lowered his hand onto the polished wood. Not the keys, just the piano itself. His eyes closed. The cold distance he had carried for 3 long years seemed to soften beneath his fingertips. Neither of them spoke again. The room didn't need words anymore. For the first time since Evelyn Carter's passing, her piano was no longer the keeper of sorrow. It had quietly become the beginning of forgiveness. Healing rarely arrives with applause. More often, it begins with a single trembling note. The music room remained wrapped in silence. Marcus Carter stood beside the grand piano, his fingertips still resting lightly against the polished ebony surface. For years he had treated the instrument like a grave, something to be visited only in memory, never in reality. Naomi Brooks quietly gathered the small screwdrivers scattered across the piano bench. She believed the conversation was over. She believed she would quietly leave the room, finish the restoration another night if he allowed it, or pack her belongings before sunrise if he did not. Then Marcus spoke. Can it still play? Naomi looked up. There was no authority in his voice, only uncertainty. She smiled gently. It never forgot how. Marcus looked at the keyboard. I did. The words barely escaped his lips. Naomi understood immediately. He wasn't talking about the piano. Very slowly, she slid onto the edge of the bench. I'll only play a few notes. Marcus gave a silent nod. Her fingers hovered above the ivory keys. Not rushing, not performing, almost asking permission. Then, the first chord filled the room. Warm, clear, gentle enough to disturb neither the silence nor the memories sleeping inside it. Marcus closed his eyes. Every note seemed to dissolve the years between who he had become and who he had once been. Naomi chose no famous concerto, no dazzling performance. Instead, she played a simple lullaby, one with soft repeating phrases and quiet spaces between them. A melody a mother might hum while waiting for her child to fall asleep. Marcus recognized it instantly. His breathing faltered. My mother. Naomi didn't stop playing. I know. Marcus slowly opened his eyes. You know that song? Naomi nodded while her hands continued moving gracefully across the keys. I found handwritten sheet music inside the piano bench. She glanced toward him. Your mother had written little notes beside the melody. Marcus frowned slightly. What notes? Naomi smiled. Things like, she played another gentle phrase. Slow down here. Marcus always smiles at this part. Another phrase. Play softly. He's pretending to sleep. Marcus's lips parted, but no words came. His mother had written those notes decades ago. No one else should have known they existed. Naomi lowered the volume until the melody became almost a whisper. There was another sentence. She looked down at the keyboard. One day, when I'm no longer here, I hope this house never forgets what love sounded like. The final chord lingered in the room. Neither of them moved. Marcus stared at the piano as tears quietly gathered in his eyes. For years, he had remembered his mother's face, her voice, her smile. But somehow, he had forgotten the feeling she created whenever she played. Until now, he turned away slightly, ashamed of the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. In every negotiation, every conflict, every dangerous meeting, Marcus Carter had remained perfectly composed. Yet a single lullaby had accomplished what no enemy ever could. It broke through every wall he had built around his heart. Naomi pretended not to notice. She simply closed the keyboard cover halfway and began carefully returning each tool to its proper place. Silence became kindness. After several long moments, Marcus finally spoke again. You repaired more than the piano. Naomi looked at him. I only repaired what was already here. Marcus slowly shook his head. No. His voice was steadier now. You gave this house something it hasn't had in years. He glanced around the room. It feels alive. The word surprised even him. Naomi smiled, not with pride, but with quiet relief. I think your mother would be happy. Marcus looked once more at the piano. For the first time in 3 years, he pulled out the bench himself. Awkwardly, uncertainly, he sat where his mother had once sat every evening. His hands hovered above the keys. I don't remember. You don't have to remember everything, Naomi said softly. Just the first note. Marcus lowered one finger. A single key answered him. Not perfectly, not confidently, but honestly. Naomi smiled. That's how every song begins. As the note echoed through the mansion, something remarkable happened beyond the walls of the music room. The servants paused in the hallway. Mrs. Henderson looked slowly toward the 3rd floor. Even the bodyguards exchanged puzzled glances. For the first time since Evelyn Carter's passing, music no longer sounded like grief. It sounded like someone had finally found the courage to come home. The greatest inheritance is not money. It is the courage to open a door that grief has kept locked for years. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Carter estate, washing the marble halls in a warm golden glow that no one remembered seeing before. The servants noticed it first, not the sunlight. Marcus Carter, for years, the head of the household, had walked through the mansion without acknowledging anyone unless duty required it. Every order was brief, every expression unreadable. Every room seemed colder after he left. Today, something had changed. He crossed the main hallway carrying neither his phone nor a stack of business files. Instead, he stopped in front of Mrs. Henderson. I have a request. The elderly housekeeper blinked in surprise. Yes, sir. The music room. She instinctively lowered her voice. Yes, Mr. Carter. It will no longer remain locked. Silence spread through the hallway. Several maids froze where they stood, unsure whether they had heard correctly. Marcus continued. Calmly. It should be cleaned every morning. Mrs. Henderson's eyes glistened. And he paused for only a moment. No one is to touch the piano. The servants quietly exchanged confused glances. Marcus looked toward the staircase. Except Naomi Brooks. The hallway became completely still. Naomi, who had just entered carrying fresh linen, stopped in her tracks. She looked around, wondering if someone else shared her name. Marcus turned toward her. Beginning today, his voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable certainty. The music room is your responsibility. Naomi stared at him. I don't understand, sir. I believe you do. She lowered her eyes. I was hired as a housemaid. Marcus nodded. And now you will also be the caretaker of the most important room in this house. No applause followed. No dramatic reaction. Only quiet disbelief. Marcus walked away before anyone could respond. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Yet every person inside the mansion understood something extraordinary had happened. Later that afternoon, Naomi entered the music room carrying nothing more than a clean polishing cloth and fresh white lilies. She stopped at the doorway. The lock had been removed. For the first time in years, the room welcomed daylight. She carefully opened the windows, allowing a cool breeze to drift across the polished piano. Dust no longer belonged here. Neither did silence. As she arranged the flowers beside the instrument, Marcus appeared quietly behind her. You chose lilies. Naomi smiled softly. Mrs. Henderson told me they were your mother's favorite. Marcus looked toward the vase. She always said they reminded her that beauty didn't need to announce itself. Naomi nodded. I think she was right. They stood together without speaking. The room no longer felt forbidden. It felt remembered. Marcus slowly walked to a nearby cabinet that had remained closed since his mother's funeral. He unlocked it with a small brass key. Inside rested neatly organized sheet music, old recital programs, framed photographs, and a faded leather journal. He gently lifted the journal. My mother wrote in this almost every day. His thumb brushed lightly across the worn cover. I haven't opened it. Naomi looked at him. You weren't ready. Marcus gave a faint smile. No. Then he looked around the room. But perhaps this house is. He placed the journal carefully beside the piano. Not hidden. Not locked away. Simply resting where it belonged. Naomi understood the gesture immediately. He was no longer protecting memories by burying them. He was honoring them by allowing them to breathe. Before leaving, Marcus stopped beside the doorway. There will be guests here next week. Naomi looked up. I'd like this room to be open. She nodded. It will be. Marcus hesitated. Then, for the first time since Naomi had arrived at the estate, he spoke her name with genuine warmth. Thank you, Naomi. She smiled. You don't owe me thanks. Marcus looked once more at his mother's piano. Perhaps not. His eyes softened. But my mother would have. As he quietly left the room, Naomi returned her attention to the grand piano. She gently lifted the keyboard cover. Sunlight settled across the ivory keys. The instrument no longer waited for someone to remember it. It had become the heart of the mansion once again. And somewhere beyond the open windows, the house itself seemed to breathe a little easier. The world often believes power changes people. Sometimes, it is kindness that changes power. 1 week later, the Carter estate no longer felt like the fortress it had once been. The iron gates still guarded the property. The security team still patrolled every corridor. Marcus Carter was still the man whose name commanded fear across the city. Yet inside the mansion, something impossible had happened. Music had returned. As evening settled over Chicago, warm lights spilled from the windows of the once forbidden music room. For the first time in years, its doors stood open. Not for business, not for ceremony, but for remembrance. A handful of people gathered quietly inside. Mrs. Henderson stood near the entrance, holding back tears she no longer cared to hide. Several longtime employees who had served Marcus's mother decades earlier lined the walls in respectful silence. Even the bodyguards, men more accustomed to carrying weapons than emotions, removed their earpieces for a few precious moments. No one spoke above a whisper. At the center of the room stood the restored grand piano. Its ebony finish reflected the glow of crystal chandeliers. Every ivory key gleamed softly beneath the light. It looked exactly as Evelyn Carter had once cared for it. Alive. Marcus entered last. He wore the same tailored black suit that had become his armor for years. But tonight there was no distance in his eyes. Only gratitude. He walked slowly toward the piano before turning to the small gathering. My mother believed that every home should have a heartbeat. His voice filled the room without effort. When she died, he paused. I believed silence was the only way to honor her. His gaze rested briefly on the piano. I was wrong. The room remained perfectly still. Marcus turned toward Naomi Brooks. She stood quietly near the window in her simple black maid's uniform, looking as though she wished someone else occupied her place. She had never asked for recognition. She had never expected this evening. Marcus took one slow step toward her. This piano did not return because of money. Another step. It did not return because of power. He stopped beside her. It returned because one person cared enough to protect someone else's memories. Every pair of eyes turned toward Naomi. She lowered her head, embarrassed by the attention. Marcus gently lifted the embroidered handkerchief that still rested upon the piano. My mother used this every evening. He smiled faintly. I thought preserving it meant locking it away. He looked at Naomi. You showed me that preserving love means allowing it to live. Without another word, Marcus placed the handkerchief into Naomi's hands. Not as a gift, as trust. The room fell silent. Naomi looked at the delicate blue embroidery stitched into the linen. I can't accept this. Marcus smiled. I believe my mother already did. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus quietly pulled out the piano bench. He sat down. Not alone. He looked toward Naomi. Would you help me? She hesitated only briefly before taking the seat beside him. Together, they rested their hands above the keyboard. Marcus played the first uncertain note. Naomi found the second. Then another. Soon the simple lullaby filled the mansion once again. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but honestly. As the melody drifted through every hallway, servants stopped their work. Security guards smiled quietly to themselves. Mrs. Henderson closed her eyes, hearing not just music, but home. Marcus looked toward the framed portrait of his mother resting atop the piano. For the first time since her passing, he did not feel abandoned. He felt accompanied. When the final note faded into the evening air, no one applauded. No one wanted to disturb the silence that followed. It was the kind of silence that only appears after something broken has finally been made whole. Years later, visitors would admire the beautiful piano inside the Carter estate. Some would ask who restored such a remarkable instrument. Marcus always answered with the same quiet smile. A woman who understood that memories are not kept alive by fear, but by love. And on that unforgettable evening, everyone inside the Carter mansion learned that the greatest act of restoration had never been the piano itself. It had been a wounded heart finding the courage to play again. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.